All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going head-to-head with two programming heavyweights, Python and PHP.
Ooh, this should be interesting.
Yeah, and I think especially for folks who already know their way around Python, there might be some surprises in store when we take a closer look at PHP.
Absolutely. On the surface, they can seem like totally different worlds. But when you start digging a little deeper, you'll find some really interesting similarities in how they handle some fundamental concepts.
Right, but then again, understanding those subtle differences is key, isn't it?
Oh, totally. It's those nuances, the way they diverge in their approaches, that really highlight the strengths and even, you could say, the personalities of each language.
Exactly, and that's what we're here to uncover. So, ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
All right, let's start with something super basic. Variables. You know, those little containers where we store our data.
Yeah, the building blocks.
Exactly. Now, one of the first things you'll notice when you look at PHP code is all those dollar signs.
Oh, yeah. PHP loves its dollar signs.
It's like a visual trademark, right? Every variable name has to start with one. Whereas Python, well, it keeps things clean, straightforward, no dollar signs necessary.
True, Python's all about that minimalistic look. But, beyond that visual difference, both languages actually share a fundamental approach. Dynamic typing.
Dynamic typing. So remind me what that means again.
Sure, it means you don't have to explicitly tell the program what type of data a variable will hold. Like, is it going to be a number, a piece of text, or something else? You just assign the value, and the language figures it out on the fly.
Ah, okay. So it gives you a bit more freedom and flexibility.
Yeah, exactly. But, like with most freedoms, there's a trade-off. You have to be a bit more careful because the program won't necessarily catch errors related to data types until runtime.
Right, right. So it's a double-edged sword. You get flexibility, but you also have to be extra vigilant.
For sure.
Now, what about the rules for actually naming variables? Does that get tricky when comparing these two languages?
Not really. Both Python and PHP have very similar conventions. They're both case-sensitive, which means my var and my var would be treated as two completely different variables.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and neither of them lets you start a variable name with a number. Gotta start with a letter or an underscore.
Okay, so that's consistent. But I've noticed there's a stylistic difference that I find pretty interesting. Python seems to encourage using underscores to separate words in a variable name, what we call snake case,
Ah, yes, Python's love for snake case.
while PHP leans more towards camel case, where you capitalize the first letter of each word within the variable name.
Right. And that's not just a random preference. It actually reflects a bit of a cultural difference between the Python and PHP communities.
Really?
Yeah, Python, it really emphasizes readability and consistency. It wants code to look clean, almost like natural language. Snake case fits nicely with that aesthetic.
I can see that.
PHP, on the other hand, it's often more concerned with conciseness and practicality. So camel case, it packs more information into a smaller space, even if it's a bit less visually separated.
So even in a small detail like variable naming, we can already see some of those philosophical differences emerging.
Absolutely. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Now, how about we move on to data types? The different kinds of values that our variables can hold.
Okay, sounds good.
We've got the usual suspects in both languages: strings for text, integers for whole numbers, floats for those with decimals.
Booleans for true or false values. The essentials.
And what's interesting is how similar the syntax is for using these data types in both Python and PHP. It's like they speak the same language, even though they have their own dialects, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. And that can definitely make the transition between the two smoother. But there are some little gems hidden within those commonalities that are worth pointing out.
Oh, like what?
Well, take Python's triple quotes, for example. It's a unique feature that lets you create multi-line strings, often used for documentation right within the code, what we call doc strings.
Ah, I see. So it's like Python's built-in way of encouraging clear and well-documented code.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about readability and self-explanatory code.
Makes sense. But what happens when you need to represent the idea of nothingness in your code?
Ah, the concept of nothingness. It's more profound than it sounds. Python uses the keyword none for that, right?
Right, none.
But PHP, it uses null.
So are those two basically the same thing, just with different spellings?
Well, at first glance, they might seem interchangeable, but there are some subtle distinctions in how they behave under the hood.
Interesting. So Not completely interchangeable then.
It's a bit more nuanced than that, but we could probably spend a whole deep dive just on the concept of nothingness in programming.
Uh-huh. Maybe we should. But for now, let's move on to how you change a variable from one data type to another. What's the term for that again?
Type conversion.
Right, type conversion. It's like transforming a piece of text into a number or vice versa.
Hmm.
Now, coming from Python, I have to admit, PHP's way of doing this, specifically using parentheses for casting, it looked a bit strange to me at first.
Yeah, I get that. It can look a bit weird to Python eyes. It's just a different approach.
So how else does PHP handle type conversion?
Well, they also have dedicated functions like invol for converting to integers, which Python typically uses functions like int.
Okay, so both languages have ways to do it, just with slightly different styles.
Yeah, and what's really cool about PHP's invol function is that it even lets you specify the base of the number system you're working with. So you can work with decimal, hexadecimal, even binary, all within the same function.
Ah, that's pretty handy if you're doing low-level programming or dealing with different number representations.
Exactly. That's where PHP's flexibility really shines.
Okay, let's tackle another concept. Constants. Those values that are supposed to remain fixed throughout your program, like maybe the mathematical constant pi.
Yeah, the unchangeables.
Exactly. Now, this is where we see those philosophical differences between Python and PHP really come into play.
Right. Python, it takes a more relaxed approach to constants. It's like, hey, we'll use all caps to signal that this variable should be treated as a constant, but, technically you could still change it if you really wanted to.
So it's more of a gentleman's agreement than a hard and fast rule.
Exactly. PHP, on the other hand, is like, no way, constants are serious business. They have specific mechanisms like define and the const keyword that actually enforce immutability at runtime. Once a constant is defined, its value is locked in, period.
So it's like PHP is saying, we value security and predictability above all else.
Exactly. Especially in web development, you don't want critical values changing unexpectedly in a live application. That could be disastrous.
I could see that. Now, are there any other quirks when it comes to constants in PHP?
Oh, yeah, a couple of things. First, PHP constants, they don't use that $ prefix that's so common for variables.
Interesting. So you have to be extra careful to distinguish between them in the code.
Right. And second, PHP constants have to be defined at the top level of your code. You can't just tuck them away inside a function or a loop.
So again, PHP is emphasizing structure and consistency.
Precisely.
Well, it's amazing how even in something as seemingly basic as constants, we see those fundamental differences in philosophy shining through. It's like Python and PHP have different personalities, different ways of approaching the world.
I like that analogy. And as we delve into more complex concepts like control flow and functions, those personality differences are only going to become more apparent.
I can't wait.
All right, welcome back. So last time, we started uncovering some of those interesting similarities and differences between Python and PHP, focusing on things like variables and data types.
Right, the foundation.
Exactly. But now let's shift gears and see how these two languages approach something a bit more dynamic. Control flow.
Control flow. So we're talking about the decisions, the repetitions, all those things that determine how a program actually, flows from one step to the next.
Exactly. It's all about directing the program's execution. And this is where those philosophical differences we talked about earlier really start to shine through.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Where should we start?
Well, how about with those good old conditional statements? The if-then-else structures that let a program choose different paths based on certain conditions.
Right, the classic if this, then that logic.
Mm.
I'm guessing both Python and PHP have ways to handle that.
Oh, absolutely. They both offer the familiar keywords, if, else, if, and else. The basic tools for decision-making are there in both languages.
But knowing these two, I'm sure there are some stylistic variations in how they implement those tools.
You bet. Python, with its love for clean and visually clear code, it uses indentation to define blocks of code associated with those conditional statements. No curly braces required.
Ah, so it's all about that visual hierarchy, using white space to structure the code.
Exactly. It's like outlining an essay. It makes it really easy to see the flow of logic.
Okay, I can see how that would appeal to Python's sense of readability. So how does PHP handle those code blocks?
PHP, it takes a more traditional approach, using curly braces to enclose blocks of code, just like you'd see in languages like C or Java.
So it's a bit more explicit, visually marking those code boundaries with braces.
Right. And honestly, both approaches have their pros and cons. Some developers find Python's indentation super clean and refreshing, while others might prefer the explicitness of curly braces, especially when you're dealing with really complex code.
I can see that. It's all about what you're used to and what feels more natural to you.
For sure.
Now, how about we move on to loops? Those structures that let you repeat a block of code multiple times.
Yeah, loops, essential for any programming language. And both Python and PHP, they offer those two classic loop types, for loops and while loops.
Okay, so the basic tools are there again. But are there any, let's say, personality quirks when it comes to how they implement those loops?
Oh, there always are. For instance, Python's for loop, it's super elegant when you're working with sequences of data, like lists or strings. It lets you directly access each element in the sequence without having to mess around with, manually managing indices or
Oh,
counters.
so it simplifies things quite a bit.
Yeah.
What about PHP's for loop?
It's a bit more traditional, closer to that C-style syntax where you explicitly initialize a counter variable, set a condition for the loop to keep running, and then increment that counter with each iteration.
Okay, so it's a bit more hands-on, requiring you to manage those loop details yourself.
Exactly. And then there's this kind of quirky little feature in Python called the for.else construct.
For.else. Okay, that sounds interesting. I don't think I've encountered that one before.
Yeah, it might raise some eyebrows for PHP developers. It basically allows you to execute a block of code after the loop has finished, but only if the loop ran its full course without being interrupted by a break statement.
Ah, so it's like a way to check if the loop completed naturally.
Yeah, it can be really handy for handling certain scenarios, though it might feel a bit counterintuitive at first.
Okay, well, I'll have to play around with that one. Now let's move on to functions. Those reusable blocks of code that are like the workhorses of any program.
Right. Functions. They're essential for breaking down complex tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Exactly. And both Python and PHP, of course, they allow you to define functions, pass data to them through arguments, and get results back through those return values.
All the standard stuff.
But as always, I'm sure there are some interesting nuances lurking beneath the surface.
Oh, definitely. One of the things I love about Python functions is their ability to handle default values for arguments. If you don't explicitly provide a value for a certain argument when you call the function, it can just use a predefined default value.
Ah, so it's like having a built-in safety net, ensuring that the function still works even if you miss an argument.
Exactly. It just makes things a bit more flexible and convenient.
I like that. Now, what about the way you pass arguments to functions? Any differences there?
One of Python's cool features is keyword arguments. You can actually label each argument when you call a function, so it's super clear what value is being assigned to what parameter.
Ah, so it's not just relying on the order of the arguments, you're explicitly naming them.
Exactly. And that not only makes your code more readable, but also reduces the chance of making errors, especially when you're dealing with functions that have a lot of parameters.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about how functions return values? Do both languages handle that in the same way?
They both allow functions to return values, but Python has this neat trick up its sleeve, the ability to return multiple values at once. You can pack multiple values into a tuple and return that, and then the caller can unpack those values into separate variables.
Oh, that's pretty handy. So you could, for example, return both a result and an error code from the same function.
Exactly. Simplifies things quite a bit in certain scenarios.
I like that kind of efficiency.
Now, PHP, it typically sticks to returning just a single value from a function. But of course, there are workarounds if you really need to return multiple values.
I figured there would be. Programmers are pretty resourceful when it comes to finding ways to bend the rules, so to speak.
Oh, definitely.
Well, it's fascinating how even in the way they handle functions, we see these distinct philosophies at play.
Absolutely. And it brings us to a really important question for anyone listening. What kind of project are you working on, and which language might be a better fit for your needs?
That's a great point. Choosing the right language is so crucial. But before we dive into that, I think we should wrap up our discussion of functions by talking about one more important concept: scope.
Ah, yes. Scope. The rules of the game when it comes to variable visibility.
Right. I remember when I was first learning to code, scope was one of those things that really tripped me up.
It's a common stumbling block. But once you understand the principles, it's really not that complicated. Both Python and PHP, they generally follow this concept of nested scopes, which basically means that code inside a function can see and access variables defined outside of it, but not the other way around.
So it's like a one-way mirror. The inner blocks of code can see out, but the outer blocks can't see in.
That's a great way to put it.
But I'm guessing things get a bit more complex when you want to actually modify a variable from an outer scope within a function, right?
Right, it gets a bit more nuanced then. Python, it takes a pretty strict approach. If you want to modify a variable from outside the function, you have to use the global keyword explicitly. It's like putting up a flag and saying, hey, I'm not creating a new variable here. I want to work with the one from the outside.
So Python forces you to be very deliberate about your intentions. What about PHP? Does it handle that situation differently?
PHP, it offers a bit more flexibility in how you can access and modify global variables within functions. It has the global keyword as well, but it also provides this thing called the global's superglobal array.
A super global array.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds interesting, but also maybe a bit dangerous if you're not careful.
Yeah, PHP's approach gives you more power, but with that power comes responsibility. You got to be really mindful of how you're using global variables within functions, because accidentally modifying one could lead to some tricky bugs down the line.
So it seems like Python's approach to scope might be a bit more restrictive, but also encourages cleaner and safer code, while PHP's approach gives you more freedom, but also requires a bit more caution.
That's a great way to summarize it. And this theme of balancing flexibility and predictability, it really runs through our whole comparison of these two languages, doesn't it?
It really does. It's like they have these different personalities, different ways of approaching problems.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that crucial question, which language is the right tool for the job?
Welcome back for the final part of our Python versus PHP showdown.
Showdown, I like that.
Yeah. Last time we left off with that tricky concept of scope.
Scope. You know, it might sound kind of intimidating, but really it's just about understanding where your variables can and can't be seen in your code.
Right, right. Like their boundary.
Yeah, exactly. And both Python and PHP, they both generally use this idea of nested scopes, Code inside a function, it can see the variables that live outside of it,
Okay.
but not the other way around.
Ah.
It's like, imagine those Russian nesting dolls.
Oh, yeah.
Each doll represents a different scope, right? Variables declared inside a doll, well, they're visible to any dolls nested inside it,
Got it.
but not to the ones outside.
So it's like if you're inside a smaller doll, you can see out to the bigger dolls, but the bigger dolls can't see in.
Exactly.
Makes sense. But I bet things get a bit more complicated when you actually want to change a variable from an outer scope from inside a function.
Right. Yeah, you're getting into some trickier territory there.
Yeah.
Python, it's very strict about this. If you want to modify a variable from an outer scope while you're inside a function, you have to use the global keyword. Explicitly say, hey, I'm not making a new variable here. I'm dealing with the one from the outside world.
Okay, so Python forces you to be very clear about what you're doing.
Exactly. Now, PHP, it offers a bit more flexibility. It has the global keyword too, but it also has this thing called the global's superglobal array.
A super global array, what's that?
Think of it like a big dictionary that holds all the global variables.
Okay.
You can access and change those global variables through this array, even from inside a function.
Sounds powerful, but maybe also a bit dangerous if you're not careful.
Yeah, for sure. It gives you more power, but you really got to be careful not to accidentally mess with those global variables when you're working inside functions. Could cause some unexpected issues.
So kind of like with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Exactly. And that's a theme that we've seen throughout this whole Python PHP comparison, isn't it?
Totally. This balance between flexibility and predictability, it really seems to be at the heart of their different philosophies.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Variables, data types, control flow, functions, even scope. But, at the end of the day, what does it all mean for someone who's actually choosing between these two languages?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Which tool is the right one for the job? Well, Python, with its focus on readability, that clear syntax, and just that massive library ecosystem, it's become a real powerhouse in fields like data science, machine learning, scientific computing, even web development.
Right, it's like the Swiss Army knife of programming languages.
Exactly. Now, PHP, it's got this long history as the go-to language for the web. It's what powers a huge chunk of the internet, from those small personal blogs to massive enterprise applications.
It's not just a legacy thing, right?
Yeah.
It still has a super active community, tons of frameworks and tools specifically for web development.
Oh, for sure. And it really excels at that back-end stuff, interacting with databases, handling server-side logic.
So it seems like if you're diving into data analysis, machine learning, maybe some scientific research, Python is probably your best bet.
Probably. But if you're building dynamic websites, especially ones that heavily rely on databases and all that server-side magic, then
That's right.
PHP is still a fantastic choice.
And I guess ultimately choosing the best language always depends on the specific project, your team's experience, all those practical considerations.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Python and PHP. Hopefully everyone listening now has a little better understanding of what makes these two languages tick.
And maybe even a bit inspired to explore them further.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us, and happy coding.